Paul and his associates were mentioned as being zealous, and Jesus himself was mentioned as demonstrating zeal for his Father. Okay, so we've got all these good examples to follow, and they're all worth our time. They're all worth examining and looking at. But I thought it would be a good idea to take the ones that the author focuses on the most, Asa, or rather Phineas, and then afterward Asa, and spend most of our time talking about those. So a good way to start is by getting into Numbers chapter 25. And we're just going to read not every scrap of relevant text here, but we're going to look at a fair amount, and we'll get basically the whole story and hopefully come to a better understanding of what exactly was going on and how Phineas demonstrated this great zeal, and then what we can learn from it. So let's start reading in Numbers chapter 25, verse 1. Who will volunteer to read the first 5 verses of the chapter? Sam.
And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. And they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat and bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself into Baal-peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said unto Moses, Take all the heads of the people, and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, Slay ye every one of his men that were joined unto Baal-peor.
Okay, thank you. So, boy, that got rough in a hurry, didn't it? For some context, why were the Israelites doing this?
They were intermarrying with people that God said you shouldn't intermarry with.
Okay, that's definitely the relevant law, and we're going to talk about that in a second, but I'm going to take issue with the term marry. It doesn't seem that they were necessarily doing that. Now, there's one case in particular that Phineas is going to deal with where it's pointed more in that direction, but it looks like what they're doing is short of marriage for the most part. It looks like it's cult prostitution. Okay, so most of the cultures in that area, in the area of Canaan, the Canaanites themselves were like this, and the Moabites did this as well. A lot of the pagan worship rituals that they had involved cult prostitution. So they had basically Baal cults, and they had Asherah cults, and often, so Baal being the sort of storm god, sky god, and Asherah being sort of an earth goddess. And they both are big into fertility. And so what better way in these people's minds to worship this god and this goddess than to fertilize, euphemistically? Yeah, it's a silly idea, but you can understand why people who are very fleshly in their motives in the first place would be drawn to that sort of an idea and would come up with that sort of ritual when they're not that concerned about what God actually wants. So the Israelites are drawn into this. They're drawn into this very bad behavior. But fornication, that's a big deal. I don't mean to minimize the importance of the fornication. But what makes this even worse than if it were just plain old cut and dry fornication? Mark? Okay, yeah. So what is that? Commandment number 1? You shall have no other gods before me? Well, they're already off the wagon. So this is a major, major problem. Now, I almost called you the wrong name, but Nancy mentioned obliquely the law on the matter. She said they're not supposed to intermarry with the peoples of the land. And I don't want to take the time to read these, but if you want to go look at them on your own time. Exodus chapter 34, verses 11 through 16. It doesn't say specifically, thou shalt not fornicate with the cult prostitutes of the people of Moab, but the principle is certainly there. He's saying, don't intermarry, don't mingle with the peoples of the land that you're going to conquer. Not that technically included Moab, but the principle is still there. Because they're going to lead you into idolatry, and that's exactly what is happening here. So they knew better than to get involved with this. You can also find something similar in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 2 through 5. Granted, that hadn't actually been spoken to them yet, but obviously God has told them this principle before, and it's not changing. Okay, so what is God's decision, and sort of by extension Moses' decision, of how to deal with this problem and nip it in the bud?
The death penalty. It was swift.
Sorry?
The death penalty.
Okay, yeah, and when you say the death penalty, what is it, like lethal injection, after a trial by your peers, and a long, long death row period where you get as many appeals as you like?
He commanded enemies go and slay them right away.
Yeah, so he said, we don't have time for that. We're not going to take this on a case-by-case basis. We've delegated authority, so he gets together the leaders and he says, all right, you guys, you know who's under your authority. This is the way we're going to handle this. This stops. And there's a hint in there in verse 3. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And if all you read was this section, then you would think that would refer to what God says to Moses right after that when he says, hang the people who are responsible for this in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger may turn away from Israel. But there's actually more to it, and we're going to see that confirmed a little bit later. God has sent a plague on the people as well. So he sent a plague, and that is killing people. And he's saying, now, what I want you to do is also basically round up the ringleaders, kill them, and hang them out on display so that everybody can see where this leads and knows what the law is on this and how it's going to be handled, so they'll cut it out. Okay, so it's pretty, I don't want to say harsh, it's very cut and dry, I guess. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room here. Okay, let's keep reading. Who will take verses 6 through 9?
And indeed one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses, and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Now when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation, took a javelin in his hand, and he went after the man of Israel into the tent, and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through the body. So the plague stopped among the children of Israel. And those who died in the plague were 24,000.
Thank you. Okay, so we get the confirmation of that plague that I just mentioned. It makes it clear exactly what was happening. Why does it seem, why do we focus in? I mean, there's 24,000 people who die as a result of this. Obviously, a lot of them were involved. A lot of the Israelites were involved in this sin. Why does it seem to focus in on this one case?
Because he, without being bold, went and stopped those people. He was meaning to just run.
Well, but why did Phineas even? Sorry, I don't mean to cut off. Why did even Phineas? Why did he go after them, but not one of the other 23,999?
Because they were right in front of him.
Okay, it was right in front of him. He saw it. And what's some of the reason for that, Matt?
They were being blatant about it. They were just kind of throwing it in everybody's face, like, I don't care. I'm going to do this regardless of what you think.
And what's the timing, by the way?
It was after everybody else was killed.
Sorry?
It was after everyone, all the men, it was after all the hanging and the plague had already started, and they know why they're being punished.
Yeah, it's already been made clear. God's already made his position on this very clear. The people are already executing the judgment, and now a bunch of them are, what does it say? In the sight of the whole congregation, they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they see this guy, as Matt said, just blatantly like, I don't care who sees it. I've got this Midianite woman, and we're going to go and copulate in this tent. What? It's just absolutely egregious, the attitude behind it, in addition to the behavior that God has already passed judgment on. So that's why Phineas focuses on that and says, all right, I'm going to put a stop to this. Now, was Phineas legally justified in what he did? Mark?
Yeah, I was saying the law, violation of the law was a death sentence.
Okay, now,
I'll come back and let you retort because I think you should have one. But the law doesn't say if you see somebody committing a capital offense, then you just go kill them, right? It prescribes that this should be handled in a more legal setting. You're supposed to have judges for this purpose, and if the judgment comes down right, every charge must be established by 2 or 3 witnesses, and after that, then the people are supposed to stone this person to death. So that's the way executions are supposed to go, and yet Phineas just goes and grabs a spear and takes care of it himself. So what's going on here?
Well, we know that it's not wrong because what he did turned God's wrath on him.
Okay, so we've got the evidence from the backside. God approves of it. Absolutely. That answers it for us, but how could Phineas know that he was justified? Matt?
Well, I mean, at this point, God's really already passed his judgment on his feeling on the matter. So it's not, there's no higher judge to take it to. You know, in this case, he is the Supreme Court. He's made it clear this is where I mean, the whole point is they just were standing there mourning for all the people they had just put to death for this very thing. And then somebody comes in there and does it right in front of them. He knew he was justified without judge, jury, and all that because God, the ultimate authority, had already basically given him the approval for this.
So God had certainly passed judgment on the behavior and what they deserve, but having appointed Phineas, that's where we have a slight hiccup. I don't think it's something insurmountable. Misty?
I don't know that we could ever know truly the answer that he said, Phineas, you didn't do this. But this was a special circumstance, right?
Okay, yeah.
They've just been commanded to do this. Moses told them to go out to
By
the
whom?
leaders. By God. Told
Well,
Moses.
God tells Moses, I want this taken care of.
Moses tells Aaron and tells the leaders.
Moses gets the leaders together. That includes Phineas. And says, go kill the people responsible. Exactly right. Do you have more?
I was just going to say, and you can see from that, they've just done all this. Oops, we missed one.
Yeah. So it might look to us now, and I wanted to go through all of that because I don't want to leave you, any of it, here with the impression that if you see something that God has clearly said is not okay, then it's okay for you to pick up a spear and go and take care of the problem. It's not the way that it works. Now, I certainly hope that none of us ever comes into a situation where it will be justified for us to do something like Phineas was justified in doing here. But he was justified. Mark.
He was also a Levite.
He was, I'm sorry, what?
A Levite.
Oh, a Levite, yeah. Okay.
So, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, he would wouldn't he have had, as a Levite and the priest, part of the priesthood, wouldn't that have been an innate right and responsibility that he would have had?
He certainly has more authority in that realm than random Abe on the street here, but not necessarily to the point where he could just go killing people and nobody questioned that. Like if he had just gone and saw some guy, looked at him in a way he didn't like, and he slit the guy's throat and went on, the rest of the people wouldn't, and Moses wouldn't have said, well, he's a Levite, so that's okay. So I see what you're saying, and there is something to it, but I think mostly there's something to it because he is one of the leaders of the people that Moses had tasked with taking care of this problem. So the Levites did function as judges, but not necessarily as executioners in most cases. There are exceptions, like Samuel, for instance. We'll talk about him another time. Okay, so Phineas is justified in doing this. That doesn't mean that you should go home and sharpen your spears. Why is it that Phineas jumps up and does this? Out of all those people that are at the entrance of the tent of meeting weeping, they're all concerned. They all realize what's happened. They all are they want the plague to stop. They want the sin to stop. They all seem to sit idly. Why does Phineas jump up and take care of business?
Well, it says, if you read farther on down in verse 11, it says, that the Lord said, my wrath from the sons of Israel, and that he was jealous with my jealousy among them.
Mm-hmm.
So he had zeal for what God was saying.
Exactly right. It's because of
His great zeal. That's not to say that nobody else there had any zeal, but he had an exceptional zeal. that was enough to motivate, to drive him to say, I cannot sit here and watch this happen. I know what I have the authority, I know what I have the right to do, I know what they deserve, and I want this to stop because that's what God wants. And so he got up and did what he knew God expected. Matt.
It's kind of like we talked about last week with Jehu, and with him tearing down the idols of Baal and destroying the temple and gathering up all the prophets and worshipers and kind of tricking them into coming and then killing them all. We didn't see necessarily a direct command to do that, but we know it's what God wanted, and he was pleased with how he handled that.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, let's keep reading a little bit farther here. Who will take verses 10 through 15 for us? Nancy?
Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel, because he was zealous with my zeal among them, so that I did not consume the children of Israel in my zeal. Therefore say, Behold, I give to him my covenant of peace. And it shall be to him and his descendants after him a covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the children of Israel. The name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, the son of Salu, a leader of a father's house among the Simeonites. The name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur. He was head of the people of a father's house in Midian.
Thank you. Okay, now there might seem like there's some ancillary information there that's not really important to us, but I think there's actually a lot more that we can get out of this text as we think about zeal and how it ought to be directed and motivated. First of all, how did God obviously feel about Phinehas' action? He was very, very pleased with it. He was very pleased with Phinehas, and what did that lead God to do? Sorry? Okay, well, actually, that's the other half. That's the long-term answer. So he makes a very, very long-term covenant and a reward for Phinehas because of his action. And what was he willing to do for the people?
Stop the plague.
Sorry?
Stop the plague.
Stop the plague. Okay, so that's their biggest concern right now. And Phinehas has averted the wrath of God. That's huge. That's impressive. That's, in a sense, that's a type of Christ. There's a sacrifice of blood, in a sense. There's atonement made, is the way that God says it in verse 13. He was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. He stepped in and shed somebody's blood in order to avert God's wrath. Okay. Now, why do the identities of the man and woman in question here matter? Tony.
Because they were sons and daughters of leaders.
Yeah.
And they, no one was exempt.
So it wasn't just, oh, okay, so you're going, I wanted to get there eventually, but we'll start there instead. You say no one was exempt. Interesting thought. So you might have expected that anybody, and Phinehas in particular, would have said, well, but I mean, this guy's kind of important. So let's, maybe sweep it under the rug, or we'll go to him privately and say, you really ought to cut this out or it's going to be a big problem. But Phinehas isn't worried about that. Let's think about it in these terms as well. He's an important guy. What is his name? Zur? No, Zimri. I was thinking, Zur is her father. Zimri. This Zimri guy, he's the chief of a father's house, and you would think that would mean he probably has a fair number of people who are going to be upset over his being killed. So imagine your oldest uncle or something like that. Even if he was in the wrong, even if he was doing something that he shouldn't have been doing, and then someone else just came over and shot him dead. Now, you might not go after them for blood, but you would probably want to see them prosecuted. You would probably want some kind of, you would think, justice to be served. Phinehas doesn't think twice about that. Phineas surely knows that there are plenty of people who want to avenge this guy. If you read the sections in the law in Exodus about avenging and what is it, blood guilt, all that sort of thing, there's a pretty highly developed system of vengeance among these people. Phineas doesn't worry about it. He just goes and does it, even though this is a pretty highly placed individual. Okay, there's another aspect of the status of these two individuals that's important. Anyone else have something to add about that? Misty.
I've always wondered if he was that blatant to do it so soon after the death of the others. Why wasn't he one of the ones that was killed to begin with? Because more than likely, he should have been, based on the command that was given. So, I don't know if he was part of the ones that was just missed, because again, he said, he's important, he's got a lot of people, he was kind of hidden. But it's very blatant that with his death, that stopped the play.
Yeah. So we get kind of, I'm sorry, Mallory, is your hand up or your hand?
Well, I was a little confused because it sounded like he was the son of a chief, and all the chiefs were just killed. So then he was like, next in line, so they just killed the succession of that family, So, probably it was like, the blame part, but he probably got this because he wasn't the chief, his dad was just killed, so then he's like, well,
it sounds like it's possible that he hadn't actually engaged in the sin until the purge, for lack of a better term, had already been done. And then after all that, like they're sitting at the end of the tent meeting, weeping over the plague, right? They've already rounded up the ringleaders and taken care of them. And then he takes this woman as if like we've just been through all this, we're still suffering for it, and he's saying, no, it's okay. I'm just going to go ahead and do the same old thing again. So it is this blatant disregard. It is, it has these major ramifications. Further, think about the position of authority that this guy has means he's likely to promote the sin further. It would be one thing if young guy at the bottom of the rungs is the bottom of the ladder as far as succession and prestige is concerned was engaging in this cult prostitution. It's another when a guy at the sort of the top end is doing it. It can be seen as promoting it, and it's not only he who is in this sort of position. The woman that he has chosen is the daughter of a local chieftain, king, that sort of thing. And we can see that if we, it says that that she is the daughter of Zur, who was the tribal head of a father's house in Midian. If you turn just a couple pages away to chapter 31, verse 8. They killed the kings of Midian with the rest of their slain, Ebi, Rechem, Zur, etc., etc. Her father, it sounds like, was among the kings of Midian that they later went and killed. So it's as if a highly placed Israelite and a highly placed Midianite are joining together, and this gets to where Nancy was looking earlier at marriage, and like now we're getting even closer to this "you shall not intermarry with the peoples of the land" thing. It looks like they're trying to promote this. Like they're trying to align themselves and intermarry, and it just gets, like the more we learn about this, the worse and worse it looks. Okay, so all of that considered, we saw how Phineas took care of us. We've seen a lot of the reasons that he felt he needed to and that he felt he was justified in acting. Did Phineas act in love? Because that was the focus of the lesson, right? Loving service. Was Phineas' act a loving one? Okay, I see a couple of head shakes. Why? Head nods, I guess, is the right word. This is a nod. Misty?
Well, if you think about love the way the world defines love, the answer would obviously be no. But we're not talking about the way the world defines love, in that whatever I want is great, if I love this woman, because I'm attracted to her. That's not what he's talking about here. I think he's truly talking about the love of God, the love of his law, the love of justice. And in that term, absolutely, he was acting in love.
Absolutely. So his love for the Lord is a lot more important than his love for this particular individual, first of all. And further, his love for the Lord dictates that he ought to have love for the nation. The nation that this man is trying to lead astray. is trying to lead against God.
So this was absolutely an act of love. Now, it's one of those acts where, like Misty said, the way the world looks at it, you're going to say, well, that's not very loving. It was an act of hatred. He killed this person. It wasn't an act of hatred. He didn't go out and kill this person because he hated him. He went out and killed this person because he loved the Lord and he loved the Lord's people. He loved the Lord as God and he loved his neighbor as himself. That's God's entire law. Okay, let's finish out this story. Who will read verses 16 through 18?
Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Be hostile to the Midianites and strike them, for they have been hostile to you with their tricks, with which they have deceived you into the affair of Peor and in the affair of Cosbi, the daughter of the leader of Midian, their sister who was slain in the day of the plague because of Peor.
Okay, thank you. So, this gives us a hint. Why does God make a national vendetta out of this? I mean, it's just the action of one woman, right? And so why does God say, go after the entire nation? Nancy?
It was a scheme from the entire nation. They schemed this to happen, not the one woman.
Yeah, it wasn't just her, was it? Is that what you were going to say, Misty?
I was saying, she was just the figurehead of that.
Exactly. She was just part of this overall plot. Now, if we go again into chapter 31 and read verse 16, behold these, and he's talking about the Moabites and the Midianites, behold these on Balaam's advice caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor, and so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. Okay. These people came in and did this deliberately on the advice of Balaam? So, what exactly did Balaam suggest? Brian?
You almost have to back up a little bit about Balaam, because there was a king that tried to get Balaam to curse Israel. So he inquired of God what he wanted to do. And God said not to curse him. And this happened a couple times. So in order to circumvent that, he introduced the women meetings. And then, of course, they fell into the harlotry. So in a way, he kind of took the back door.
That's exactly right. So Balaam is in this position of knowing he can't curse these people and make it stick. He can only make stick what God tells him. And he doesn't. It's not him who's making it stick. It's God. He knows that, but he kind of likes this idea of getting paid off by the king, Balak. So he comes up with another way. He says, look, I can't curse them, but you don't have to do that, king. If you can get them to go against the Lord, then he will curse them. So he deliberately put together this plan to deliberately tempt them into sin. Do we see anything like that today? Misty?
I think you see that with all the religious leaders that say you don't have to be baptized. You just need to believe. You know, I mean, you can take a look at any of the things that are in the Bible where people come in religiously. There's people out there that are doing that, promoting that as if that's the way to do it, and yet we see that's not the case.
Okay, so that's one example of it, and we can see this all over the place. Sometimes it's really obvious, sometimes it's not very obvious, but it happens all the time, right?
But that's not a plan. They believe in themselves though too.
Okay, and that's true. Now, think about the Moabites and the Midianite women. These people who are doing it, do they believe that the Lord is the God of heaven and earth, the creator of all things, and is the only God? Or do they believe that their God, Baal, and their God is Asherah, and whatever else? Do they believe in that? So that's the mindset that we have to get into here. Most of the time, the people who do this kind of thing, it's not the sort of insidious, I want their God to curse them. It's
I think that this is the way things are, and maybe I can get in and convince them otherwise from what they already know and believe. Now, that doesn't mean that we should paint anybody with a different opinion as, trying to do what Balaam was doing, because that's not the case. But do look out for people like that, because even these people, even these Moabites and Midianites who came in and did this, they didn't think of it as an evil act that they were doing. They thought of it as a good thing. We'll bring these people into the fold. We'll teach them the great blessings of Baal and Asherah. Mrs. Graham?
1 John, we've been studying on Sunday mornings, exact
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah, same kind of thing. They're distorting the truth, even if they believe it. Okay. It occurs to me, I went past one of my notes earlier. Okay, so I wanted to talk for a minute about question 4 on page 47 of the book. Do people misunderstand the zealous actions of servants like Phinehas in Numbers 25? Who might disapprove of your zeal, and how would you handle this? That's 3 questions for the price of 1.
Some people would look at it and think that he just did it. They didn't, without ever really going and studying the whole chapter. They would just say, well, look, he just did it.
Yeah.
That's all he is.
And I'm sure a lot of, it's quite possible that the relatives of this, I can't remember his name, of Zimri, might have looked at it that way. It's quite likely that the people of Moab and Midian would have looked at it that way. But that was a misunderstanding. Now, we're likely to come across misunderstandings as well. What we need to do is make sure, like Phinehas, we have our bases covered. Don't go off half-cocked. Don't go and act in zeal when you don't actually have the support to do so. But once you've got that, then you should be zealous for the Lord, even if somebody misunderstands it and mischaracterizes it. Okay. I think we've covered most of the other stuff that I wanted to cover there. We won't talk about Phinehas in Joshua 22, but there is another example there of him defusing a potentially violent and escalating situation, and it shows his love, again, for God's people, and it speaks very well of Phinehas. Now, we've only got about 5 minutes left, so I don't anticipate getting all the way through Asa, but that's okay. Turn to 1 Kings chapter 15. 1 Kings 15. And I will go ahead and read verses 9 through 15 of this chapter. In the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Asa began to reign over Judah, and he reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom, and Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as David his father had done. He put away the male cult prostitutes out of the land and removed all the idols that his fathers had made. He also removed Maacah, his mother, from being queen mother because she had made an abominable image for Asherah, and Asa cut down her image and burned it at the brook Kidron. But the high places were not taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly true to the Lord all his days, and he brought into the house of the Lord the sacred gifts of his father and his own sacred gifts, silver and gold and vessels. Okay, so what's the overall verdict on Asa? There's a verdict given on every one of the kings in this book. What's his? Sorry? He's a good king. He's the ones where when we teach our kids about the 20 kings of Israel and the 20 kings of Judah, there's only a handful of the kings that are labeled as good kings, and Asa is one of them. Good king. What kind of things did he accomplish? Sorry?
He removed the idols.
Okay, so that's pretty big. It's kind of a sad commentary that you're dealing with basically the same kinds of idols that Phinehas was dealing with in his day, several hundred years before. That's a little sad. But nevertheless, Asa comes along and he is trying to wipe them out, and clean it out, purify, and start fresh. Mark?
There's a drove out people.
Okay, yeah, so again, we've got cult prostitution. This time it's male cult prostitution, and he takes care of that problem as well.
When he removed his mother, she had built an Asherah to an idol, of an idol, and he went that far for a family member to get rid of.
Yeah, so just like with Phinehas, there were plenty of reasons for him to look at this guy Zimri and say, maybe I'm not going to get involved in this one. There were plenty of reasons for Asa to say, I mean, she's my mom. Maybe I'm going to look the other way on this, but he doesn't let that slide. He removes her from her position of authority and position of influence and tries to take care of the problem that she has been promoting. Okay, so definitely a great example we've talked about in the next question I was going to ask, the difficult and righteous actions that he took. What shortcomings did he have? Nancy?
He didn't take away the high places where they had been.
Yeah, the high places remain, so that's a shame. And that's a sort of a black mark on his record, but overall the verdict is good for him. And that's the point that the author of the book wants to get across to us, that yeah, he had shortcomings. Well, I know I've got shortcomings. I know that if someone were to write down, my years of life and the things that I had accomplished and the things that I failed to accomplish, there are a lot of things that are going to be on that list of failures. But there can still be a good verdict overall. So don't let that hamper you and keep you from doing good things. Now, there's a lot more, and we're not going to get into it tonight. Part of me wants to say we'll start on this next week, but part of me wants to say let's just move on into the next one. Maybe I think I'll just go through and briefly summarize over the next couple of minutes here. Over the rest of, not the rest, but verse 16 through 24, the rest of Asa's record in 1 Kings at least, you get some more details about some particular instances of his life and his reign. And particularly we see what happens when the northern king, Baasha, decides that he is going to make things hard and really tighten the screws on the southern kingdom, Judah. And so he's fortifying one city and he's trying to cut them off economically from the north, and he's doing so pretty effectively. And Asa deals with it. He takes all those treasures out of the temple and he uses those to pay off the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad. Got that right? Ben-Hadad. And he says, "Hey, I'll pay you. Why don't we be buddies instead of you and Baasha being buddies? And why don't you go and attack Baasha? And then we'll be buddies from now on." And Ben-Hadad says, "Oh, sounds good to me." And so it works. And that eases the pressure that the northern kingdom is putting on Asa and his kingdom. And it allows Asa to come in and say, this fortified city that you guys have been building up, well, we're just going to tear that down. We're going to move our borders another couple miles into your territory. And we're going to build up those cities with those exact same materials so that you won't be able to do this to us again. And it shows, again, that same zeal for the Lord's people in Asa. It's a great example. His methods leave a little bit to be desired. And if you go and read the account in 2 Chronicles 14 through 16 about him, which is worth your time, you'll see that we're not the only ones who think so. God thought his methods left a little bit to be desired. So we see this example, Asa. Asa is a really interesting character. He's complex. He's got a good side. He's got a bad side. And he's someone that we should compare ourselves to, because he does a great job of showing us that even though we might have these huge shortcomings, we can still have a great zeal for the Lord and for his work. And as long as we give that zeal the right boundaries and the right direction and drive it with love, then it will lead to good things. Okay, thank you. Next week we will plan to just go through all of Lesson 10. Again, read it, go through the questions, study up a little bit, read some of the scriptures that it mentions. We're going to spend more time in the scriptures than we'll spend in the book itself, of course. Thank you.
I never use any tools. Does he do it like full time? Oh yeah. There was a whale. There was a whale.
Wait, I already did all my
If you will, mark in your songbooks number 255. We'll sing that after the invitation, brought to you by Matt. And then we'll sing number 500, O Thou Fount of Every Blessing. 500. O thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy, never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me ever to adore thee. May I still thy goodness prove, while the hope of endless glory fills my heart with joy and love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come. And I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Never let me wander from thee. Never leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above.
One thing I've always found interesting about the Bible is some of the, and I am by no means a mathematician at all. You can ask any math teacher I've ever had. But it's some of the symmetry between the numbers in the Bible. Now, whether that's an accident or not, I don't really I know it's not with all of it, but some of it, I like how it matches up. And a couple examples is, 40 days. If I say 40 days and 40 nights, the first thing that pops into your head, and what most of the little kids here can tell you, is that's how long it rained. It wasn't how long Noah was on the ark, but that's how long it rained. And then also one that we talk about quite a bit with the temptation of Jesus, but the part that led up to that was he was wandering in the wilderness fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. Another one, if I say 3 days, then chances are what pops into your head is Jesus and his burial and how long he was in the tomb for. But also, and a lot of times I think that one we do hear compared to Jonah and the fish. And so I've always found it interesting how some of this kind of matches up. And a lot of people today will take some of those things and they'll try to turn it into predictions of when the world's going to end and things like that are going to happen. And I think that's looking way too much into it. And I stand here tonight, there's no proof that I know of a connection between the 40 days and 40 nights of the rain on the ark and the 40 days and 40 nights that Jesus was wandering in the wilderness. But it's just something that I found interesting. And another one that I wanted to talk about tonight, if you would open up to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17, and we're going to read verse 40, and this is a story that we're all very familiar with. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So we're all very familiar with the story of David and Goliath. It's probably one of the first stories that we learn as young kids and young children. And most, even people, atheists that don't believe in God, are familiar with this story. But we know that David took 5 smooth stones. Now, we know that he only needed one of those stones, but he had 5 stones. And then if you look down to verse 50 of the same chapter, 50 and 51 say, So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Now we know that he had been outfitted with a sword and armor, but it was too heavy for him. And all he used was was one of the stones. Then 51 says, Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. So the stone likely killed Goliath where he was standing, but to just kind of make sure for good measure, David comes in and cuts off his head with his own sword, which you fast forward years later, we see that sword come back again into David's life, where he's given that sword to defend himself. But when I think about this, I always think about the comparison of, Goliath was this giant, this monster. And I can remember when I was little in a Bible class, we made a lifelike size of the dimensions of Goliath. And I mean, this thing he's huge. Makes like Shaquille O'Neal and some of the tallest people look like children. And he was obviously a physical specimen to look at. And when you think about the devil, the descriptions used for the devil, walks about like a roaring lion. Some of those same descriptions are used for him as something that we should fear, and that we should have a healthy respect for. That this being can potentially have power over us, and has power over a lot of people. But like David, we have 5 stones, and we know the plan of salvation. Romans 10:17, you have to hear the word. Romans 10:10, you have to believe the word. Luke 13:3, you have to repent. Matthew 10:32, confession. And then finally, what a lot of people will say is baptism, Acts 2:38. So there's our 5 stones that we have, that we've been provided with to defend ourselves against the giant that we have to slay. But as we know, David also had the sword there. He had a 6th weapon there that he could choose from. And for us, that's to remain faithful. David, likely Goliath was dead where he stood as soon as that stone hit him. But David took that one extra step to make sure that the job was done. And that's what we have to do. We have to live a life where we remain faithful. And that's the sword that we use. And we can see if you look over to Revelation chapter 2, not a lot of people go to Revelation when you talk about remaining faithful. You know, we're all familiar with the passages. I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. But Revelation 2:10, I really like where it says, "Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life." So it's not be baptized and then it's all said and done. It's not be faithful for these 10 days. Now they know there's a time limit here for some of the stuff they're about to face of being 10 days, but it's be faithful until death. So for us as Christians, we've got those 5 stones. We've got that sword that we can use to finish the job. So if you're not a Christian, you don't have those stones in your arsenal. Now you've heard the word, you believe the word. Will you confess that Jesus is the Son of God? Will you repent of your sins? Will you be baptized tonight? It's set up in here, ready to go. So if there's anyone that needs to be baptized, we can do so this very hour. Well, there's 3 minutes left, so maybe not this very hour. But if you have said or done something, we still have that goal that we have to remain faithful. And it's tough. You know, it's not easy. Things test our faith, and there are struggles that everybody has and everybody goes through. But at the end, we have the command that we're to remain faithful until death. And you have that opportunity here tonight, whether publicly or privately, to make it right with God if you need to. So if there's anyone that needs to respond, come forward as we stand and sing.
No longer to linger the world's things that are higher, things that are lower, these have the Lord in my side. I will hasten to Him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to Thee. I am resolved to go to the Savior, leaving my sin and strife. He is the true one, He is the just one, He hath the words of life. I will hasten to Him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to Thee. I am resolved to follow the Savior, faithful and true each day. Heed what He saith, do what He willeth, He is the living way. I will hasten to Him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to Thee. I am resolved to enter the kingdom, leaving the paths of sin. Friends may oppose me, foes may beset me, still will I enter in. I will hasten to Him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to Thee.
Thank you, Jeremy and Matt, tonight for their lessons, and all the teachers and his pastor one here tonight as well. Thank you, Justin and Taylor and Bellman in our prayers. Do we have any other announcements that need to be made?
Zeal was sick again tonight, so they're not with us. And we have got, just a reminder, we've got that quick clean out Saturday, 9 o'clock. For those of you who've got to clear out the loft area above the nursery. So we can start renovating that. So keep all those sick in our prayers. 9 a.m. Saturday morning to clean out the loft. Anything else? All right, we'll be letting the closing prayer.
While we humble ourselves before you, thank you God, for the opportunity that we have to come to quiet this place this evening. And you set aside the cares of this life and open your word, Father. Study the grateful, Father, for the brotherhood that lead in this place. And we're grateful, Father, for the ways that you blessed us and that we continue to grow. We're so thankful for that. We ask your blessing on all of the young children, those that just recently been born, and the ones that are at various stages of their young lives. We pray, Father, for them. We pray for their healing. Most of all, Father, we pray for the opportunity to have a positive impact on their lives and spiritual standpoint. Pray, Father, we might always remember that their young eyes are upon us and they're watching us, what we do and what we say. Help us, Father, to be godly examples before them, that they might, when the time comes, to make up their minds about Jesus, that they might remember the examples that were set before them, things that were taught to them, that they might be Christians. Father, we ask you to be with us all as we depart this place. We pray that you give us a safe journey to our hearts, that you give us a pleasant night's rest, and to be revealed and allow us to open our eyes to the day. Thank you so much for Jesus. And thank you for the wonderful hope of eternal life, Father. May we never take it or see it as a common thing, but to realize how special it is to know that as we live this life and see it slowly drain away from us over time, we know that this is just a temporary state. And that your people will live again. They will live forever. They will live in abundance and glory that they cannot imagine. And thank you, Father, for Jesus, who has secured that for us and going to the cross. And we love him, and we worship him and devote our lives to him. Please have mercy on our souls as we make this prayer in Jesus' dear name.
Yeah. No, I said throw it away, fool.
The dog is
Trooper.
I
needed this really was I was like, and I tried to like put my finger in and like move over and like, and I was like, there's nothing to actually crawl. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm not gonna get out of here. And I'm like wiggling it. They were down. I just
they were down 11 or down. They scored 11. They were down. Yeah, a minute ago. You
I lights on my phone. I'm like,
come on. Good point.
Alright, man, that's like this. Well, you're gonna do the next one, right?